may have been expecting Julie Gelfand. I'm not at all like Julie Gelfand. Beyond that, though, we both work in the same office. We both have been working on the same project, and it's the project I'd like to tell you about this morning. This is an audit that was tabled, primarily on an audit that was tabled just this last fall, looking at how Canada was doing on climate change, as Scott has mentioned. We looked at it from both the perspective of the domestic side as well as the international side. So this is what I'd like to cover this morning quickly. I'd like to give you a bit of a background because some of you may not be familiar with the Office of the Auditor General and the role of the Commissioner and the kind of role that we play in, if you like, the policy ecosystem in Canada. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the report that we just tabled and bring out some of the key highlights, and then talk very briefly about some of the things that have happened since our audit was tabled, or as you'll see, some of the things that have not yet happened. The Auditor General of Canada it's one of Canada's longest standing institutions. Established in 1878, it provides independent advice to Parliament, specifically related to originally the financial management of government, but it has expanded beyond that to include information on how the federal government is performing, basically comparing what it sets out to do versus what it has actually done. We are also the auditor for Canada's territorial governments, Nunavut, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Because we're an officer of Parliament, it's essential that we be nonpartisan. Our annual reports contain observations and recommendations, ways in which we think the federal government can improve the management of its operations. But we place a very heavy emphasis on being fact-based and objective. And we do not comment directly on the merits of policy. We report on how that policy is implemented. The role of the Commissioner was established within the Office of the Auditor General in 1995. It's a position that reports directly to the Auditor General, and our function is more specific. We basically cover the portfolio looking at environmental issues and sustainable development issues. And as a former commissioner, Scott is very familiar with that role and some of the challenges of trying to look at those kinds of issues within the body of an organization that has been in place for as long as the Office of the Auditor General has been. We also have specific responsibilities in terms of monitoring how Canada is doing on its federal sustainable development strategy and how the departmental sustainable development strategies are being carried out. We also manage an environmental petitions process, which I'd be happy to describe in more detail if you're interested. In the past, what we have done is reported independently to Parliament, providing specific reports oriented around environmental and sustainable development issues. As I mentioned, it's a bit of a policy ecosystem. This illustrates some of the key elements. So we have Parliament, our lawmakers. We have the federal government responsible for executing that legislation and the direction provided by Parliament. And our role, off in the left-hand corner, is really to look at how the federal government is doing and to report to Parliament. Our latest report covered a wide range of different issues, as our reports have tended to do. Everything from mitigating climate change to environmental monitoring in the oil sands in Alberta, to looking at navigation in the Canadian Arctic, looking at the implementation of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, the latest one, and then, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the sustainable development strategies and the petitions. And in each report, we also include a commissioner's perspective, which is an opportunity for the commissioner to summarize her or his observations about what's come forward in the report and to put it in perspective for parliamentarians. In the chapter which we tabled last fall on mitigating climate change, we looked at a number of different things. Some of these are issues that we've looked at several times in the past. As I'm sure you all appreciate, climate change is a critical issue for Canada. It's a critical issue internationally, and it is something that has continued to be on our radar, and I expect will continue to be something we examine again in the future. In the report that we tabled in October, what we looked at was whether the federal government had put in place the reduction measures for greenhouse gas emissions that are consistent first with good regulatory development processes, and whether it's assessed the success of those measures, whether it has mechanisms for working with the provinces and territories to reduce emissions, and whether it has an implementation plan that describes how federal entities will contribute to achieving the Copenhagen Accord for 2020, whether it's used sound methods for estimating and reporting future emissions. So it's not just enough to know what our emissions are now, we need to know where they're going in order to take appropriate policy measures. And then of particular interest from the international perspective, we looked at the money that was provided under the Fast Start Financing Initiative, the $1.2 billion, which was committed to as a result of the Copenhagen Accord. So maybe just a bit of perspective. All of these issues are clearly relevant to the Canadian domestic situation, but I think you'll see that there's lots of connections internationally as well, since many of these issues also apply for international concerns. So what happened when we looked at how things were going domestically? I suspect the basic message here is not going to be unfamiliar to most of you. The Canadian target set under the Copenhagen Accord is roughly 612 megatons to be achieved by the year 2020. Without regulatory measures in place, we would have missed that, or we are projected to miss that by a wide mark. With the measures which are currently put in place, Environment Canada, based on their own analysis, has estimated that that target will not be hit, and that in fact, emissions are continuing to increase. As we approach the year 2020, the evidence is becoming stronger that that trend is not changing. We looked in more detail at what the federal measures were to reduce emissions. We found that the current federal measures, so the measures that have been announced, the regulations based on the analysis, again, done by Environment Canada, indicates that the federal contribution is roughly a third of the total contribution of regulatory measures that have been taken by the federal and provincial governments combined. Coming out of the analysis that we did, we recognized that there was a need for a planning process that would get Canada to its target. And our recommendation was that that kind of a planning process be put in place, that it be developed jointly with the provinces and the territories, and that it spell out in quantitative terms, and this is important, what contribution the federal government will make to Canada's 2020 target and beyond. As Scott has already alluded to, this is not just a one-year, we're not just aiming for 2020, there is clearly a need for action beyond that year. The planning process that we suggested should also include a detailed description of what measures the federal government is proposing to take and what the planned timelines for those are. It's clearly important when you're dealing with the need to make financial investments, when you're needing to make decisions about where to locate, what kinds of technology to use, that you have an advanced understanding of what's coming down the pipe. We also recommended that the federal government conduct regular reviews to assess its progress, as it is doing, but that it make those reports publicly available, both in terms of what has been accomplished, but also what remains to be accomplished, and how it will fill the gaps. Turning to the international side, this is a bit of a different story, because here Canada's contribution has been primarily through funding. As I mentioned, the Fast Start Financing Initiative, a commitment made under the Copenhagen Accord. As its share of that, Canada provided $1.2 billion over the 3 years, 2010 to 2012. It's important to note, however, that most of that funding was provided as repayable contributions, i.e. loans, primarily to multilateral banks such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so on. The remainder of that funding is provided as direct grants. Based on the analysis that we did, and I'll show you the table in a minute, most of the financing provided under the Fast Start financing has not yet reached the final recipients. So that there are questions then about the effectiveness of the loan and what the long-term results will be, both in terms of the emissions of reductions of emissions, but also in terms of whether we as Canadians, Canadian taxpayers, if you will, are getting value for our money in terms of reducing emissions, improving the capacity of developing countries to act to achieve their immediate targets on climate change, but also to build capacity for the future. This table is in our report, and I won't go into the details of it, but you can see that much of the funding, very roughly 2/3 of it, was provided in the form of repayable contributions. That much of that funding, as of last May, when we closed the books on our audit work, had not yet reached the final recipients. So the key messages here really are that there is a need for accountability, there is a need for good measurement of results, there is a need to ensure that financing measures taken are actually going to achieve the results expected, both in terms of action on the ground, but then also in terms of reducing emissions over the long run. So what's happened since we tabled our audit last October? On the domestic front, there's been no additional regulatory action announced. As Scott mentioned earlier, Canada's national commitment for the Paris Conference of the Parties has not yet been announced, though I believe the Prime Minister suggested that that announcement would be made this month. And the latest national inventory prepared by Environment Canada, looking at Canada's emissions, indicates that our emissions are continuing to rise. On the international side, after our audit was tabled, towards the end of November, the Minister of the Environment announced $300 million in Canadian to be provided to the Green Climate Fund. At that time, it was not clear, based on the publicly available documents, what the mix would be of grants versus loans. And as of the 30th of April, based on the, again, publicly available information, those funds have not yet been provided. And with that, I'll turn it over to Catherine Potvin for some further follow-up comments. Thank you.